Well, to many of you, I think Professor Valerie M. Hudson needs no introduction. She's widely recognized for her teaching and research, particularly at Brigham Young University. In particular, some of her classes, I think, have reached the status of those kinds of classes that everyone tells you have to take before you graduate, or your undergraduate experience will be lacking, particularly in international policy, methodology, and the international political economy of women. In 1998, BYU awarded Professor Hudson the Carl G. Mazur in Excellence in Teaching Award. She graduated magna cum laude from BYU with a degree in political science and minors in Russian and international policy. During the completion of her MA and PhD work at The Ohio State University, she later taught at Otterbein College, Northwestern University, and Rutgers University before returning to BYU in 1987 as an assistant professor in political science. Professor Hudson served as the director of graduate studies here at the Kennedy Center, for which we're extremely grateful, from 1990 to 1996, and then returned to full-time teaching and research. We're very, very grateful that Professor Hudson would take time from her research and teaching to come and speak to you today. As I'm sure you'll learn, her research has been widely recognized. I think she spent the summer running from an interview with CNN to something with MSNBC to reading a review of her book, Bare Branches, in the Wall Street Journal, reviewed by James Q. Wilson. She is truly a scholar of national and international renown, and we're grateful to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Valerie Hudson.
Thanks, Corey. I didn't recognize myself in there. I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. The Kennedy Center is very dear to my heart. Many of my best experiences here on campus have been with the Kennedy Center and its interdisciplinary focus on things international. And the work that my co-author, Andrea Denboer, and I have done on Bare Branches is radically interdisciplinary. There's no doubt about that. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief, although for a professor, I don't know if I can do it, but because what I'd like to do is engage you in questions and answers and discussions. So let me go ahead and say that the preference for male offspring has long been a part of most cultures. However, over the past century, only in Asia do we find persistence of abnormally high sex ratios, that is, sex ratios favoring males. Sex ratios are usually given as number of males per 100 females. Let's get a few of those basic ratios down. We're going to put up a few overheads here, so we'll be talking the same language. Let's see, where'd that little microphone go? Oh, there it is. All right. Okay, wonderful. Okay, I'll just yell loud while Matt tries to figure this out. As I'm sure you've been already reading, there are actually more boys born on the planet than girls. About 105 to 107 boy babies are born for every 100 girl babies born. In fact, I love our keen knowledge. Did you know the conception rate is 160? About 160 boys are conceived for every 100 girls conceived. Most of the miscarriages and stillbirths are actually of baby boys, but that still means that the number of boys born is higher than the number of girls born. Now, normal early childhood, we're talking from birth to 4 years old, it begins dropping a bit, about 105. Normal sex ratio for children over 5 is about 1 to 1. There is a higher male mortality in early childhood. Some of you are familiar with sex-linked genetic diseases such as hemophilia and ALS and things of that nature. Also, there's a higher mortality rate for boys from severe childhood illnesses, such as severe diarrhea or severe respiratory illnesses. So by the time you get to over age 5, it's about 1 to 1. Now, if we were looking over all ages from birth to death in a society, the sex ratio would probably be about 98, maybe 99 males per females, and this is, of course, due to longer female life expectancy. Okay, so it starts out about 107, but it's going to end up about 98, 99. Let's look at some other sex ratios here. I'm sorry, these look like they might be a little harder for you to see in the back, and I apologize for that. Here we're looking at the regions of the world and looking at the sex ratios there, and this is over all the population. So you can see that Africa is fairly normal. Europe is weird, but in that it has more females than males. Most of this dearth is actually in Eastern Europe and Russia. For example, in Russia, there are 24 million fewer males than females because the young adult males tend to self-destruct, I'm sorry to say. Latin America and the Caribbean, it's roughly normal. North America, roughly normal. But notice Asia. Notice Oceania even to a certain degree there. And of course, Asia constitutes about half of the world's population, so you can see how that affects the overall world sex ratio there. Let's look at those juvenile ratios. All right. Here we're looking about age 0 to 4, and again, we're looking about 104, 105 would be fairly normal. And as you can see here, a few things kind of come out and jump out at you. Again, we've got Asia there with almost 107. Oceania is a little high, but not too high. The rest are fairly normal. Okay, with looks like the drop-off in the number of male children is severest in Africa. Now, birth sex ratios are extremely hard to come by in countries in the third world, especially for India. However, and in other countries, the birth sex ratio is very political, like in China. But here, let me give you some of the official sex ratios that we've found. I'm sorry, that didn't Xerox very well. But the birth sex ratio has been reported anywhere from a low of about 114 to a high of 121. Okay? The most recent Chinese census suggests that we're looking at a birth sex ratio of a minimum of 118, and it's probably 120 to 121 is actually more accurate. India, you can imagine birth sex ratios in India are very hard to come by because not many of the rural women actually give birth in hospitals. So again, we have a low of about 111, but we have reports of highs of 132, 156, especially in the north and northwest of India, which has been called the Bermuda Triangle for girls. Sex ratios in the southern part of India are actually fairly normal, such as Kerala has a normal sex ratio. South Korea used to have a fairly big problem. About 10 or so years ago, they were up around the same levels as China. But the most recent census shows that they've managed to beat it down under 110 at least, which is, I think, constitutes significant progress. And Taiwan has consistently hovered around 109, 110 for the last 10 years. Okay. Okay, these abnormally skewed sex ratios then contribute to the phenomenon of what is called the missing women of Asia. Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen has remarked that his calculations show that there are who should be there alive but are not there. And an important part of that, of course, is sex ratios. Let me just put a diagram here. Here we're actually looking at only 7 countries, some of which are fairly small, such as Afghanistan. But you can see here that the tally of missing women is really quite significant, especially in the larger nations of China and India there. And so our figures show that in just these 7 countries in Asia, there are well over 90 million missing women. Okay, just in those. Now this trend has a preference for male offspring has been around in Asia for at least a millennium. Oh, I tell you, sorry about that, Corey. I have such grace. I was born on a Tuesday. This trend, however, has really taken off since the mid-1980s. And why is that? Well, I think you can imagine it was the advent of technologies that allowed you to identify the sex of your fetus. It used to be you had to wait till the child was born to figure out if it was a girl or a boy. But now, originally with amniocentesis and chorionic villi sampling, now we have the less invasive ultrasound. So at about 16 to 18 weeks, the sex of a fetus can be identified. This technology, once it spread to Asia, became very prevalent. The Chinese government itself began to manufacture portable ultrasound machines that were on little carts so that they could be taken out to the most obscure villages in the rural areas. Same in India, only it wasn't government sponsored. It was sponsored by enterprising businessmen who saw a great demand for this kind of service. Scholar Judith Bannister has a series of maps which I think allows one to see in a very graphic fashion how selection against daughters has become more widespread over time. This is ironic because we often think of progress as almost necessarily bringing about an increased status for women in the world. But in this case, it's been the opposite. Progress has actually meant greater ease of discrimination against women. Let's take a look at these maps. All right. Bannister is a scholar of China, and so these maps are going to be about China here. You can see here this slightly darker area. You're beginning to get abnormal sex ratios, but most of the rest of the country have fairly normal sex ratios. This is 1982. These are sex ratios 0 to 14. But still, anything above 105 is definitely abnormal. Okay, let's fast forward here. (1990). Look, we're beginning to see some pockets here where the sex ratio across ages 0 to 114 may be as high as 113.5. 1995. We see that these areas of extremely abnormal sex ratios begin to spread. And now it's virtually impossible to find areas of China outside of, say, Xinjiang and Tibet where the sex ratios are normal. 2000. I think in this case a picture does say 1,000 words, doesn't it? Okay. This practice of selection against female infants is now prevalent throughout virtually all of China, with the exception of Tibet and Xinjiang. Now, due to time concerns, I'm not going to detail the many reasons underlying the devaluation of daughters, though I'm happy to take that up in the question and answer section. What I would rather speak of in the time given to me is the other side of the coin to these missing women. When girls go missing from birth populations, a subpopulation of males who are, in a sense, surplus will be created. In China, there is a term for such men, guangge, meaning bare branches, or those young men who will not be able to marry and form families of their own because the girls who should have grown up to become their wives were disposed of instead. Using conservative statistical assumptions, we anticipate there being approximately 28 surplus young adult males, that is, young males age is 15 to 35 in India by the year 2020, and approximately 31 million surplus young adult males in China in the year 2020. The boys that were born in 1985, arguably around the first year that this prenatal sex identification technology became widespread in Asia, they are just turning 19 this year. And with every successive year, both the sheer number as well as the proportion of bare branches in the society will rise. Let me show you the actual figures upon which we base these projections. Okay, these are our projections for China. Again, we're looking only at the young adult age group in the year 2020. We have sort of a more conservative estimate and kind of a less conservative estimate there. Actually, these are all conservative estimates because look at these sex ratios that we're assuming. Birth sex ratios of about 115. Well, the birth sex ratio in China is probably 120 or above at this time period. So these are fairly conservative estimates. We're looking at a minimum of about 29 million surplus young adult males and at least 33 million. I would argue there's probably going to be more than 33 million in China. All right. In India, we did a similar analysis. Okay. This one using a more conservative sex ratio, about 109. This is probably more accurate. The birth sex ratio in India is about 113. So conservatively speaking, you'd be looking at least 28 million surplus young adult males. We think it's much more likely that you're looking more at about 31, 32 million surplus young adult males. And it should be noted that several of the surrounding countries also have deep sex ratio problems. Pakistan probably has the worst sex ratios in all of Asia. Taiwan also has skewed sex ratios that we looked at as well. Now, the question for such nations as China and India then becomes, and we can get that out of the way now. I'm not going to use it anymore. Will the fact that 12 to 15% of their young men not being able to form families be a matter of concern for them? We are already seeing anecdotal evidence that bare branches are becoming a source of instability for these nations. For example, in India, one village counselor in an area with very high sex ratios made this comment to a journalist that unmarried young men are turning to crime and violence against women in their area has increased. The journalist went on to note, with galloping unemployment, shrinking land holdings in a predominantly agricultural state, and no family responsibility, Haryana's vagrant bachelors spend their time playing cards, drinking, harassing local females, and making a thorough nuisance of themselves. One farmer he spoke to said simply, they have become a social menace. Nations with sizable populations of bare branches find social instability amplified. In high sex ratio societies, it is young men who are already at risk for antisocial behavior. Young men of low status, those who are less educated, less skilled, they are the young men who will not marry. Young men with advantages, with education, so forth, they will marry. In India, researchers have noted the persistent and statistically significant relationship between sex ratio and levels of violent crime at the state level. theorists believe that the reason unattached young adult males have such higher levels of violence and crime is because only with commitment to the formation of a new family does a man gain a real stake in a system that's based on law and order rather than physical force, in which they enjoy a natural advantage. Furthermore, others have noted that men actually undergo a hormonal change upon making a commitment, which may physically change their propensity for violence and antisocial behavior. How many of you men are engaged or married? Okay, you are actually in a different hormonal state than the other men in the room. Thankfully. Thank you. A society in which a significant proportion of young adult males do not make that transition, all right, from enjoying a system based on physical force to preferring a system based on law and order, is a society in which violence, crime, and other markers of social instability will be aggravated. Now, this is not to say that skewed sex ratios are a necessary condition for violence and crime and instability. After all, the sex ratio in Rwanda in 1994 was absolutely normal, and we had a genocide there. But rather, what we're suggesting is that these abnormal sex ratios are definitely an amplifying factor to these unfortunate societal phenomena. So a rise in societal instability can be predicted for nations such as China and India and neighbors such as Pakistan. However, it is also important to consider governmental response here. Historically speaking, governments do become aware of the security dimension involved here. Most make a turn towards authoritarianism as a result. Furthermore, as Bear Branch collectives have been involved in several important rebellions in the history of these nations, governments also begin to perceive that the internal threat posed by large numbers of Bear Branches may be as or more serious than external threats they may be facing. Governments typically try to export Bear Branches either through outmigration, settlement of frontier areas, or co-optation into the military, which military is then sent far, far away from metropolitan areas or seats of power. In a sense, then, the calculus of security and deterrence is affected by the demographics of these Bear Branches. Since almost 40% of the world's population resides in China and India alone, this is a phenomenon that may not only have regional security implications, but international security implications as well. As noted, we literally stand at the threshold of time in which these rising numbers of Bear Branches will become an important social force in their societies. The prospects for democracy and peace in Asia may be diminished in lockstep with the diminished value of the daughters there. Barbara Miller has called the maintenance of a normal sex ratio a public good that governments ignore at their peril, and our research underscores that conclusion. Just as I conclude, I may say that I think one of the most gratifying things that has occurred to me outside of the birth of my 6 children has been on the 15th of July. On the 15th of July, the Chinese government announced a new nationwide initiative to value the life of girls. In fact, their initiative is called Care for Girls. They hope to normalize the birth-sex ratio by the year 2010, and they intend to do so by paying parents not to abort or kill their girls. They will give them free education, they will build them a house, they will pay them a small pension in old age if they simply don't kill their daughters. While we might lament the fact that such crude economic measures are seen as the only way to affect whether these girls live or die, I am very grateful that the Chinese government has begun this initiative, and I applaud them for it. As to what will happen in India, that's unclear. The Indian government has recently passed a law in which every ultrasound machine is registered with the government. It has a serial number stamped on it. And every time a woman goes for an ultrasound, on pain of criminal penalties, her name and her identifying information and the serial number of the ultrasound machine must be recorded. If she then goes on to abort a female fetus, then in some fashion that I don't quite understand, the owners of the ultrasound machine will be held criminally liable. I'm not sure whether that's going to make a difference. I can see a whole bunch of loopholes, and I think you probably can too. But nevertheless, it's a step in the right direction. I feel in some ways to say that I think the type of research that we've done echoes some of the themes in the Family Proclamation, which is when you get things right at the heart of society. And the heart of society is the relationship between men and women. When you get those things right, in a sense, your nation will reap the benefits therefrom. When you get those things horribly, horribly wrong, as we see with this phenomenon of sex-selective abortion and female infanticide, then I believe the country will pay for that. And I think that our research underscores that. Thank you very much, and we'll open it to questions and so forth.
Just to remind you again to please ask your question to the microphone. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? There's a young man with a striped shirt.
Yeah. Hello? Okay. I'm interested in what you talked about as far as the hormonal changes in men and commitment patterns. You kind of glanced over that. Is there any research you can cite or anything more specific you can say about that? Because that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, no, it's not something I made up for myself. By the way, are you engaged? Never. Okay. Yeah, I will refer you to my book where all of that research is cited. But what biologists have discovered is that, at least in the human male, serum testosterone levels tend to peak in early young adulthood. However, this serum testosterone is related to issues of competition and one-upmanship, usually related to the game of acquiring a mate. How many of you girls have known young men who have become very different when they're among their friends as versus alone with you? I see them laughing. Okay. When men are in a setting where they are subtly, at least, if not explicitly, competing with other men, that raises serum testosterone to help them compete. When a man does make a commitment, and we're talking about a firm commitment, so living together probably doesn't work as well, but when you get engaged, when you get married, your serum testosterone level actually drops significantly. If you were to become divorced again, your serum testosterone level would rise again. And of course, all of the research on testosterone has a lot of controversy associated with it, but the bottom line is your level of serum testosterone does affect your propensity to flout rules, engage in risky behavior, and even engage in behavior that may be illegal, and violent behavior as well. So every society, you know, I hate to make this seem overly biological, every society has as one of its main tasks getting its pool of young men to commit to the society by committing to a family, a woman, and so forth. I guess that probably gives some background to Brigham Young's statement, right? One of my students once told me the sex ratio at BYU. And I can't remember what it was now, but we were trying to speculate on whether that sex rate, it's not perfectly even, whether the difference in the number of males and females created some interesting behavior here at BYU. Professor Peterson, he's up here in the front. I don't know where his, if you want to just stand up and talk, that's fine.
I know that Korea has taken action.
Tell me about it, yeah.
Rather than punishing the owner of the ultrasound machine, they go after the obstetrician who would give such a test. It's not illegal. It's not illegal in Korea to have an abortion.
Right.
But it is illegal to perform a gender test prior to an abortion.
I see.
And the way people can skirt it there, of course, is to leave the country, which is not hard to do anymore.
Right.
Go to Guam, go to Japan, go to Hawaii, do the gender test, and then you can go home and have the abortion in the comfort of your your home. But as a result of this, the ratio has dropped. You mentioned that that it's dropped in South Korea. What are other countries doing that are success role models? Any others? I mean, there's some smaller countries. This is true. You know, you've got a problem in Hong Kong. You've got a problem in Malaysia. You've got a problem in other countries that have tighter societies where there must be some rules that are operating there. Is there any other hope in?
That's a really good question. In fact, I was eager to talk with you about the South Korean experience because it has been a fairly dramatic fall in sex ratio for them. But it can't be just that rule that you cited, because those rules exist in all of those nations. It is absolutely illegal for a doctor or a technician to tell you the sex of your fetus. Absolutely illegal.
There's a culture change going on. They see what they've done. They see that this imbalance is wrong. And I can give you some anecdotes about
I would love to get those.
Recognized
Wonderful.
But it's filtered into the culture. And it's a well-educated culture. It's a highly literate culture. So that they can see that we can't do this.
Okay.
You know, we can't leave boys unmarriageable. And
That's
so
interesting.
there's been a culture change that supports the legal.
I think that definitely you're hitting the nail on the head, which is the Chinese government is attempting to sort of, you know, have a big stick with the economic angle, but you really got to change what's up here. I understand in China that they have some very popular soap operas, and that some of the themes of the soap operas have been concerning the status of women, including this issue of sex-selective abortion and female infanticide. And so they're trying to get the country talking about how awful this is. They also have very prominent executions. There have been some just horrendous cases in China. One where a grandmother killed her granddaughter so that her son could try for another child and maybe have that boy. 63 years old. Her head was on the chopping block. There's been gangs that have kidnapped women, actually kidnapped female infants. Now that the sex ratio is getting so bad, people are saying to themselves, how am I ever going to find a wife for my son one day? I've aborted all my daughters. So actually now they're kidnapping and selling female infants. And just this past July, actually I think it was a year ago, July, they found 28 girl babies, newborn girl babies, stuffed in plastic bags in the back of a bus, being taken out to rural areas to sell. So the family actually raises up the girl to marry their boy. And just this past summer, that gang of kidnappers, I think there were 28 of them, were all executed. So China's trying to kind of change the way people think about these kinds of crimes as well, I believe. I'm happy to take it. There's a young lady there in green.
Dr. Hudson, I think that in westernized countries there's been a propensity to liberate women, so to speak, by creating, by enforcing male standards, perhaps, like if liberation equals what a man has, then that's what every woman should have, kind of an attitude. How do you think that there's a way to create more of an allowance for difference and mixité in a society rather than universalism equal what males have?
You know, that's a very profound question that you ask, which is our 20th century model of what it would mean to value a woman is to see in her the virtues of a man. She can work, she can make money, she can get educated, you know. But we've yet to make that shift that I believe that your question revolves around, which is to see some intrinsic worth in the female, whether or not it emulates the male. And I don't think we're there yet. But I think that we are at the threshold of time where people are now saying, let's take sex differences seriously. In fact, it was very interesting for me to hear some of the criticism of my work. I consider myself a feminist. That's not a dirty word. If you're LDS, it is possible to believe that men and women have equal standing before each other in the Lord. All right? That doesn't mean you have to reject heterosexuality or embrace abortion. You know, you don't have to do that, you know. What I believe feminism to mean is simply what I just said, and I believe you can be LDS and a feminist. I think this work is feminist. I had quite a number of feminists who actually hate this work. Some hate it because they see in it some subversive anti-choice agenda. And others hate it because it argues that we should take sex differences seriously. It matters, that you don't have equal numbers of men and women in society. It matters if your young men go unmarried. It actually does matter. And so I've been taken to task for asserting even that sex matters, that this kind of gender imbalance should do anything. They argue there's no problem. Why should that be a problem? Right? The sexes are interchangeable in a sense. So I hope for the day, as you do, then when we can see that the face of humanity is not singular. The face of humanity is a woman and a man standing side by side, holding each other's hand. That's the face of humanity that we should work for. I'm happy to take whatever questions. Matt, you pick. You've got the microphone. How about this tall young man with the stripes?
I was just going to say, as far as your research goes, it's interesting and I believe accurate and important. I noticed that there were a lot of different factors cited about young males that tended to be more negative personality traits. And I was wondering if there's some sort of balance there.
Oh, let's address that issue. That's something else. Am I saying men are demonic creatures who must be kept under control? I just want you to know that I think the men I know, the men who are closest to me, are some of the finest individuals I've ever met. I'm the mother of 6, but 5 of those are sons. Okay, so I love men. I think men are wonderful. But I also think that society has a duty to allow a young man to become who he was meant to be, which is a husband and a father. And that a society that deprives a young man of that opportunity is doing him harm. And if he then harms the society, well, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Okay? So I'm not saying these young men are horrible people or something like that. I'm just saying they have not been given the opportunities that they were owed. And if they become less than they should have become, it's not their fault. Sure. Here's a young man in gray who looks like he has a question he'd like to ask.
Well, I had that for about the last 10, 15 minutes. You mentioned about Eastern Europe mostly, that there are more girls than boys, and you kind of said that they end up their lives or something like this. Am I understanding correct?
Yeah, the issue is not birth-sex ratios. There's no indication that Eastern Europeans or Russians are aborting their girl babies or killing them after birth or valuing boys more than girls to the extent that they would starve them or neglect them. What it is young adult males in Eastern Europe and Russia who are self-destructing through drug use, alcoholism. I've read, I read a lot of material related to this research, and we were looking at death statistics for young adult males, and one of the primary death statistics was freezing to death. And I was like, freezing to death? I mean, how does that get to be one of the top causes of death for a young man? Well, they're drunk. They're drunk, and they go out, and they freeze to death overnight. So it is actually, in a sense, self-destruction going on.
Would you say that is more more predominant than their migration towards West, towards developing country where they seek work, and the same is valuable? Because I know I'm from Eastern Europe, so I know that most of my friends are working in Germany, France, Italy, Israel, and now they're going towards Saudi Arabia and whatever they can earn money, because they can earn more money than there. Could you consider that it could happen the same thing with China, where a lot of educated people will actually migrate, leaving the place for education and everything else within the China?
And we think the Chinese government would actually be very, very happy if their young men went somewhere else. Very happy. The problem is who's taking them, who's willing to take them, who's willing to let them settle. And you know, lots of young adult Chinese men try to emigrate to this country illegally and are summarily deported. But we do know there is some leakage there, and the Chinese government takes no action. It's like, hey, that's not our problem.
They should go to Eastern Europe.
There they go. Yeah, a lot of people have said, well, just send all those sprayer branches up to Russia. But what's interesting about that is that Siberia, which is where Russia has its tremendous wealth in resources is being depopulated of Russians. Okay, that area, people are just leaving it in droves. Who's coming in? It's the Chinese, right? The Chinese in the far eastern regions of Russia now constitute 8 to 9% of the population. According to statistics, that's the same population of Hispanics in Utah. So, there is some interesting demographic shifts happening there. Of course, the key issue is whether Russian women are willing to marry Russian or Chinese men, and there's some racial issues there that we'll have to see about. How about the young man in the golden tie? And then we'll move up a little bit forward.
Thank you. You mentioned during your presentation that this would be something more than a regional problem, and I wondered, I actually remember reading an article in USA Today several months ago, and that attracted me to the presentation. What specific challenges would we anticipate from this problem that's developed in Asia?
That's a very good question. I cannot make any firm predictions, but what I'm saying to U.S. security analysts is this. When you look at the problems over Jammu and Kashmir, when you look at the conflict across the Taiwan Strait, don't you ever forget that there's going to come a time when China may wish their bare branches to die in some glorious national cause rather than stay home. And that India and Pakistan may feel the same way. What I'm saying is that it alters the security calculation of those nations, where they begin to see the internal threat being as great, perhaps even greater than the external threat. So it may lower some otherwise fairly high barriers to open conflict. But that's not a prediction. That's something that security analysts ought to keep in mind. That's what I'm saying. How about this young lady up here in the black and then one in the blue?
Can you talk about the effects of these imbalances on sex trade in Asia and whether that has social and security implications?
I think the effect is huge. I mean, it's something we cannot even imagine, but there is a market for women in China, and there is developing a market for women in India and Pakistan as well, where women are kidnapped and sold like slaves on an auction block. It's all strictly illegal, of course, but the families who are desperate to find wives for their sons are willing to engage in this trade. We know that there is sale of women from North Korea, sale of women from Myanmar, sale of women from Vietnam and Laos, sale of women from Nepal, which can't afford to lose the women since they don't have a very good sex ratio. This is causing some shifts here. Unfortunately, most of these women do not end up being a wife in the way we think of a wife. They either end up being prostitutes whose bodies are abused by many men each day, or they end up being some kind of slave wife who is merely kept so that her womb may be used to produce offspring. So I think it's a horrible thing. It has lots of cascading and negative effects for women across the region. That's a good question.
Hi, you talked about how in 2020 you gave some statistics about how many extra young men there would be. And let's say theoretically at that time these nations decide to turn to warmongering to solve the problem. What nations or places of conflict do you see where it would erupt or where they would where they would be aggressive in?
Well, if you're talking, we could talk cross-border, but we could also talk internal. For example, the Maoist rebellion in Nepal going on right now, I think is fueled by the abnormal sex ratio there. But if you're talking cross-border problems, I think the two that I identified for that other young man, the conflict over Jammu and Kashmir and the conflict concerning Taiwan, I think are very important. I'd be really eager to know the sex ratio of North Korea. So Professor Peterson, if you have any data, let me know. I can't find any data on the sex ratios of North Korea, but nobody knows nothing. All right. But it would be interesting to know if the sex ratio there is abnormal as well as in South Korea. Thank you for that. Let's take this young lady because she's convenient. Hey, you worked that in. That was pretty strategic.
Just this is a current issue that we're dealing with coming up this year is gay marriage. And so I have a question, like how does, back to what we were talking about in the beginning with the commitment and its effect on males, how do you think that that relates to gay marriage as in its benefit to society and how it affects society? And also, is that an issue with the overpopulation of males?
You know, I've not thought about those issues more than just speculatively. I do not have any data that shows hormonal changes upon gay marriage or anything of the sort. Yeah.
I made a presentation on the Korean situation to a group once, and an openly gay man came up to me afterwards and said, hey, this is not a problem. The thing you were referring from your feminists implying left of feminists, but it's not seen as a problem. And I said, well, sure, it's a problem. People that are naturally inclined toward same-gender attraction don't reach these percentages we're talking about. He said, oh, they can be trained. They can be put in Army and other men's groups and
trained. Yeah. Yeah, let's just say that I really don't see that you're going to see as positive effects as you would with heterosexual marriage with natural offspring. How's that? Let's see. Let's take. We'll take these two young men last, and then we're going to say goodbye because I have a class I have to go to. The one in the middle and the one in the blue.
I got a question about you. You were saying that there's crime corresponds to this the sex ratios. I'm wondering if you have any. You mentioned anecdotal evidence. I'm wondering if there's any quantitative evidence.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Indian scholars have been on this topic for years. Again, I can refer you to my book where you'll find several interesting statistical analyses where the sex ratio in a state of India correlates significantly with levels of violent crime. Okay. Young man in blue?
Dr. Hudson, I just have a quick question. Historically, trying to get China to actually adopt Western-type ideas has been a very large problem.
Well, I hope this isn't just a Western idea.
No. Just like, well, it's just what I'm familiar with right now. It's kind of what I'm studying. But as far as like trying to get them to change that whole cultural concept about females being less important than males, do you have any suggestions for that?
Nope. As an LDS person, I'm tempted to say spread the gospel because I believe the gospel is the strongest, most progressive force for women in the world because our religion speaks of the equality of men and women. Men don't walk ahead of their wives. They don't walk beside. They walk side by side. We even have a concept of God in which our God is an exalted couple, a man and a woman united in the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. These are revolutionary ideas. Just to conceive of God as perhaps having a female face as well as a male face is absolutely revolutionary. And so aside from the gospel, I think that each culture is going to have to find its own soap opera stories. What makes cultural sense to them? How can they turn opinions around? And I think there are good men and women in each culture who are able to do that if they have the will.